Grown-up conversations on this show with people who really know their stuff. That's what we do. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by a friend of the show, John Longworth. He's the chairman of the Independent Business Network and the Foundation for Independence. He's the former head of the British Chamber of Commerce. Always good to have you with us, John. And down the line, we've got somebody from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Stephen Millard is Deputy Director for Macroeconomics and Forecasting at the National Institute. This really is Britain's premier independent economic think tank. Stephen, it's great to have you here on The Money with us. We really appreciate your time. So, John, let's talk about where the politics and the economics allied here with you. We'll go back to Stephen for some of the more technical side of the economics. You remember the 70s, if I may say so?
I do, yes.
As do I. It was a tough time, but we know that industrial action, which really framed an era politically and economically, in the end it was about inflation, hammering down real post-inflation wages. That's what caused the industrial unrest. Could the same thing happen now?
Well, it could. The 70s were a terrible time. Of course, we had rising energy costs, which affected the cost of everything, just as we have it seen at the moment. But that was all around the formation of OPEC, you know, the oil
export cutters cartel,
precisely. And it was a time that was actually then brought to an end by the Thatcher era and monetarism and all the rest of it. Now, just as you were saying last year about the whole inflationary spiral, I was talking about stagflation.
You were.
And the risk
inflation and an economic slowdown as well.
Yeah, and that is beginning to come into the language at the moment. So it's something we absolutely need to avoid. But the predictions are that inflation will start to tail off towards the end of next year. It'll start to go the other way. There are some people saying that. So that could actually ameliorate any pressure for wage rises. The most important thing is that the government have the tools to take action to prevent this happening. Rishi Sunak at the moment is doing exactly the wrong things. You know, as Patrick Minford has pointed out, the economist, Sunak should be actually using government spending, you know, very Keynesian, to actually stimulate the economy. He should be cutting taxes to stimulate the economy and actually not worrying about the debt pile, because the tax returns from a boosted economy from growth will pay down that debt pile. The government should be looking for cheaper energy. We have all the energy in the UK that we need. We have gas under our feet.
Rein in inflation if energy costs go down,
We have North Sea oil and gas. If energy costs go down, then we can deal with that. And, of course, also, there are some issues around oligopoly-type activity. We've seen the fact that petrol retailers are selling petrol at inflated prices by comparison with wholesale prices, and the Competition and Markets Authority ought to be looking at the competition issues around petrol, because that environment has changed in recent years with the acquisition of Asda, for example, and Asda was the price leader on petrol.
You mentioned oligopoly there. That's an economic term for when an industry is dominated by a small number of providers. Potentially they may collude on prices. They would, of course, deny that. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of analysis of that kind of question coming down the track. Let's go to Stephen Millard of the National Institute. Stephen, we don't want to draw you into a political discussion. That wouldn't be fair. That's not what the National Institute is for. It's not what you're about. But let's just talk a little bit about these falling real wages. The numbers came out yesterday. I think they were rather overshadowed by all the Partygate revelations, but we did see one of the biggest drop in real post-inflation wages when the numbers came out yesterday, didn't we, in the last 10 years?
Yeah, that's correct. You know, wages are rising and the rate of growth is going up, but it's not keeping up with inflation. And nor do we think it's going to keep up with inflation as the year goes on. I mean, there's a big question about, in particular, what's going to happen to public sector wage growth. But you know, even though we think that's going to go up just a little bit, we think inflation is going to continue rising at least for a while, and so the real wage fall is going to continue.
We are seeing an increase in disputes, aren't we, between trade unions and employers. The TUC comes out with some data that was recently reported. The number of disputes are going up. But trade union law now is very different, isn't it? It's much more restrictive than it was in the 1970s, Stephen.
Yeah, that's correct. It's there's a lot of process involved in calling a strike. You have to go through a number of stages. As you said earlier, the actual weight of trade union membership out of employees is much lower than it was in the 70s.
Very interesting. I mean, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, have come up with these numbers showing a lot more disputes. I've been reporting them here on The Money. And, of course, in the public sector, trade unions are strong. Doctors, teachers, nurses and so on. And while public sector wages are, on average, now higher than private sector wages, something that will annoy you, I know, what is undeniable is that over the last few years, public sector wages have been eroded more by inflation than private sector wages because of that government spending squeeze.
Yeah, but at the same time, there are more people now in the public sector than ever. You know, the numbers of civil servants is massive, and the government do actually, when there's a lack of availability of labour, need to start looking at whether, in fact, that's a wise thing that we're employing so many public and civil servants. There's also a lot of questions, of course, around the public sector. Our Independent Business Network has asked questions around why is it that the private sector are getting back to work post-pandemic and the public sector are still at home? Why do GPs not see patients, for example? You know, there's a demand from the public, I think, for the public sector to pull its socks up and actually get on and do the job. Also, of course, you know, we've got to remember in the 1970s, we had things like flying pickets. Not only
I remember.
half the people.
Crikey. And they became a pop group, didn't they?
Pop group.
The Flying Pit, Only You. Remember, they did the Alison Moyer number.
Exactly.
John, hold that important thought. That's the really us 70s cultural references. Crikey. We'll be talking about choppers and space hoppers next. But thank you to Stephen Millard of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. Fantastic you've appeared with us here, Stephen. Do come back again and we can share more of your expertise. On this same issue, let's cross over to our Northern Ireland reporter now. Doogie Beattie is with William Gilliland, the owner of XL Clothing, another former Chambers of Commerce head. God, we're spoiled. Our cup overfloweth here on GB News. Doogie, over to you.
Well, welcome to Newton Ards, this beautiful little town in County Down. With me, as you say, is William Gilliland. Now, William, shops have survived bomb attacks, recessions and property crashes. And I suppose, William, what is the main problem now with inflation?
Well, obviously, we're seeing rising costs in every single sector, not only from our energy prices, which in my last bill last quarter had literally more than doubled, through to the cost of the materials of the actual goods to get supplied. And for some of the goods that we would bring in ourselves from UK mainland or Europe, obviously the shipping costs have just become astronomical and in many ways almost totally unaffordable.
Well, we're constantly talking about food safety and manufacture and how manufacturing our own goods can keep that inflation down. What's the problems inside the rag trade at the moment?
Well, so much of in the rag trade of the brand that we would deal with, the manufacturing is based in the Far East. And although we have sort of in some ways come out of COVID, a measure of COVID, a lot of the factories, I'm being told, in the Far East, in China and Sri Lanka and others, still have their factories closed. So where typically there would be maybe a 6 months lead time into us getting our stuff delivered, there's also a 6 months lead time for them as well. And with factories closed and with staff off with COVID, and also them having problems with raw materials and energy themselves, because the energy crisis is global, this is seeing in some ways a delay in product coming through, and in other ways quite a significant delay as well, because of the distance it is being manufactured away.
And how do you see that playing out on the footfall in your shop and your tills?
Definitely you're seeing a degree of especially in the past number of weeks since the situation happened in Ukraine, there is definitely uncertainty with customers and maybe a little bit, buying a little bit more precautionary, where they would have bought maybe 4 or 5 things, it could be 1 or 2. And then there's other customers you just haven't seen, because I think the speed of what has happened as far as Ukraine is concerned, the speed at which we've seen the rise of costs and especially home costs as well, it's coming so fast for people. And we're only in spring. I mean, the real energy problems are up the road with winter time here, so people are trying to sit down and plan and think, how bad is this going to get?
Just very briefly, when do you see this, or how much worse do you see this getting?
I think it's going to get potentially a lot worse before it gets better. I think that question maybe should be given to Mr. Putin of how things are going to play out with this. We've got difficult times ahead.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.